This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Rebecca Wanzo, who teaches in the departments of African and African American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Washington University. Along with a number of scholarly and public-facing essays, she is the author of The Suffering Will Not Be Televised, African American Women in Sentimental Political Storytelling from 2009, and The Content of Our Caricature, African American Comic Art and Political Belonging from 2020. In this conversation, we discuss the expansiveness of Black study, the place of graphic and popular arts in Black studies research, and the relevance of critical theoretical work for the field. Good afternoon, Rebecca. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. We're recording this late on a Thursday afternoon, which is my last day of teaching for the week. So always I sort of feel like the perpetual 10-year-old. It's like the weekend starts today. I've been really looking forward to our conversation today. I really love your work and think it's important for many reasons, and it's really an important contribution to the field of Black studies. And so getting your voice and your perspective on the podcast is a real treat, and I think really important for this project. So I just wanted to thank you in advance, as well as welcoming you to the podcast, and appreciate your thoughtfulness in the conversation.
Well, thanks for asking me. I'm thrilled to be included. You have such a great lineup of people you've talked to.
I know. I think you're going to be an episode right up around 200. So we've just got a long list at this point. It takes a long time to scroll down the Instagram page of all the pictures. That's what we were working for. But we'll have a chance to of course talk about your work and how you imagine the field of Black studies and the relationship between these two questions. But I wanted to start really with a more personal or more intimate question and just ask you, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And what sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Well, I'll say that when I was an undergraduate, I was a quadruple major.
Are you serious?
Yes, I was.
In 4 years, or did you do extra years?
In 4 years. I was.
Oh my God.
So I majored in English, history, Black World Studies, American Studies, and I had a minor in French. And
that doesn't seem numerically possible,
well,
but you did it, so it is.
I took 6 classes at a time every semester, but I also was just the queen of paperwork. Because of the overlapping nature of the fields, I thought about interdisciplinarity very early, but I knew going in. I actually went into undergrad as an education major, and I was going to teach elementary education. But my very first semester, I just looked at what my English professor did, and I thought, I want to do that. And he wasn't an African Americanist, but I very quickly realized, wow, how amazing it could be if I could be a African American literature professor and read books. Read literature for a living and talk to people about books all day, in that very limited understanding I had of what being an English professor would be. And because
that's ripped out of a movie, and there's maybe some more annoying work along the way, actually.
Yes. I just thought, but I hadn't even known a professor. I didn't really know what a professor was in that way. But I think that, I was immediately drawn in college to thinking about the possibilities of being able to think and talk about Black people and think and talk about feminism for a living. And part of it was obviously lived experience, like the idea that the things that matter to me, the things in my life, things in my family, things in history that I found were interesting, things that were sometimes secondary in my education, even though I went to a predominantly Black public schools for, all my life, K through 12. But it still was, we read African American literature, but there was a way that you didn't get Black culture the way you get when you get these really great professors who were starting in the 90s to have come up in a moment where they'd had the faculty who really had embedded Black studies in areas where it hadn't been before, right? Like that they'd had people in the 1970s and 80s that were moving into English departments and history departments and educating groups of people who then they were like moving out, even if they weren't African Americanists. So you'd have a Victorianist who felt like you needed to include African literature, and you had my advisor did colonial American history in the history department, and it was really important for him to think about Toni Morrison and the history of Ohio. So you just had this very different moment, I think, in the 1990s, even as there were these culture wars around, multiculturalism. I didn't even really feel that in the same way in terms of my education. It felt like, of course, this is what you do. I experienced that more just being on the college campus and seeing like the culture wars in terms of the conservative students. But it was just this revelation to me that this was something that I could do for a living. And I try to remember that magic, like what a privilege it is whenever I can.
I love that. I mean, you're talking about a moment, I think a tick older than you, but that, more late 80s, early 90s. But it really was this moment. I like your point about how there was this sense of a responsibility. Like if you do one thing, colonial America, you should also be thinking about this other stuff, that sense of obligation. And I know that multiculturalism as a way of talking about these kinds of things has fallen out as a language for it, and for good reason. There's lots of reasons to criticize, but those sort of moments where it was like everything was getting pressed to be more expansive, right, is I mean, I mean, it depends on where you are, but I think so much about how my students really just live in the wake of that. That doesn't seem like a culture war, except that now they're seeing it under siege. But It really has been so much a part of their maybe high school, but certainly of their college education, and in ways that it wasn't like this exciting new thing emerging.
And I think that being a history major, in addition to, my other majors, but again, my advisor was very close to, who was a pretty well-known colonial American historian, Andrew Caton. And he died a few years ago. And he was really prolific, and he wrote this book on Ohio. And, he wrote this lovely thing in the acknowledgments about how we would just, over the years, how we would just talk about books and how our conversation was such a joy, and that he wrote this book to me as like writing the kind of book that I would want to read. And, he talked in his Ohio book, he talked about where Toni Morrison was from. He always integrated Black life into the story of Ohio because he understood it was important. He was the first person who taught me about Sally Hemings in a way that was not the TV miniseries that was, that helped me understand like these, like Annette Gordon Reed and these interventions, before the DNA thing came out. I mean, he, didn't make it a big deal. He just made it natural. And I think that this way of approaching race and diversity in the canon, and he would joke that he was like the whitest and most canonical and the most, he does founding father stuff, like all the things that people in the Midwest, all the things that people think are just supposed to be just only about white people, and then sometimes white people fighting Indians. That diversity in the story he told about the founding of the U.S. was just easy and integrated for him, and I never imagined it should be anything other than that. And so that's why these sort of fights over it, and this erasure that we see right now, I have thought about him. I think about him often, but I've thought about him a few times over the last few months, thinking, what he would do with this, and this just forced erasure of the history that people should know.
Yeah, amazing. That was amazing acknowledgement, actually. I just the way we've the way we've retreated from this '90s moment in a 7-month period here is pretty wild and radical.
Mhm.
So let me ask you about Black studies and how you think about the field. I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how you imagine the field, what your sort of portrait of it is. And I like to ask this in the context of its founding, that the origins of Black studies has a tension built into it. There's the student demand for a place to study Black life on campuses, that disciplines hadn't done this kind of work, and the Black Studies department was going to be where the Black intellectual tradition would have a home to cultivate and to expand and so forth. And that intellectual pursuit of Black studies, I think, is really a part of our contemporary vision of the field. But of course, at that moment of its origin, it was also the radicalization of Black struggle that had really contested those boundaries between study and activism, between classrooms and communities, between ideas and political action and prescription. And so that is also part of the origin, and I think the present of Black studies is this question of a political imperative, that Black studies is a political project with a certain kind of political intervention around liberation struggle. And that sort of pulls Black studies in different directions. I don't want to say opposite directions, but towards an intellectual life, but also towards a sense of political action and struggle. And so I'm interested sort of in that frame, how you imagine the field of Black studies and what that portrait is for you.
Well, I often describe Black studies a little differently than I know a lot of people do, in the sense that I think of the discipline of Black studies, and I do think it is now a discipline, and it disciplines you. Started in that moment. But I think the field goes back to Du Bois. I mean, I do think the field, as other people have argued, and what he modeled in his interdisciplinarity that was diasporic, that thought about the continent, that would blend the social sciences and literature and really every field you could art, every field you could possibly imagine, with his extraordinary creativity and his work to bring people together, to create intellectual and art projects that helped you think about the experience of Black life. That's where Black studies, to me, starts. Even as the discipline, like the institutionalization and then the formal articulation of what it might look like when you departmentalize or you become a program, start in the 60s.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Du Bois as this, model of trying to do all the things and actually doing all the things is, always
He's a totally
something.
Humbling figure that way. It's like,
Right.
okay.
Yeah, it's like, okay, we can never be that. And I think that, yes, Black studies, and I will extend this to thinking about feminism too, similarly, and around the same time, women's studies departments came about from student activism, from faculty activism, from social movements, and the demand for these departments. But the field had older origins. But I do think that there's this interesting tension between these two fields that I'm mostly situated in. American studies is probably the thing that can encompass everything I do. But, I've been situated always between Black studies and gender studies departments when I'm not in literary studies. And I think that gender studies tends to kill the mother. Like there's a presentism that I often critique about feminist theory and gender, and is very much organized around conceptual frameworks and reimaginings of how to understand gender and sex and sexuality in the body. Whereas Black studies, I think, is really rooted in long histories of the Black experience. And so I often see this in sort of citational practices that I'm like, wow, you'll still see people citing Du Bois, like, as a theoretical framework to apply. But, in gender studies, it's like, before Judith Butler, good luck. Sometimes it's just except some Black feminists like Bell Hooks. You'll still see cited. Combahee, you'll see cited, right? So, which I think is very interesting. Angela Davis. So I think, or Ansel Dua, like Black feminists of color. So I think that grounding Black work in history is really important to the project of Black studies. And to not be historically situated is something that puts you at a deficit when you try to do this work, because I think really understanding where we've come from and to have that material understanding is essential to the disciplinary project.
I love that. Thank you. That's super interesting. And it's, I was thinking as you were talking about, once you add in a sort of research or vision outside the United States, then you end up with the enormity of the literacy needed to engage that sense of a long history is, this has come up in many podcasts, but it's part of why it's so frustrating when Black studies gets characterized, by sort of more conservative discipline, colleagues as somehow easy or sort of like me studies or something. I'm like, the number of things you need to know. I mean, we can't all be a Du Bois, but we have to have a sense of the range of Du Bois, and having read and thought about all of these things and all the way, backwards and forwards from that moment. So, when you say that rooted in long history, I really feel the enormity of the task of even entering the field as a serious intellectual. That's what's beautiful, and it's so laborious. I struggle with the multidisciplinary / discipline question, and I'm always happy when somebody says, at this point, it might have a discipline and disciplining effect.
It does. And I think there are fractures in the discipline that in a variety of ways. I mean, obviously, there's this longer tradition that we might articulate as a kind of Black nationalist, with certain sort of political investments and disciplinary investments that resist, say, a Black theoretical and post-structuralist turn, right?
Mm.
I think there's still a tension between theory in Black studies and more empirical or social science and history methodologies. A tension I find very frustrating. There's also sometimes this tension in departments or fields about what does it mean to think about African studies in relationship to the U.S. and the diaspora, broadly speaking. So there are these various fractures, but that's the nature of disciplinarity as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah, traditions are in some ways defined by their disputes as much as their common threads. And you've talked already a little bit about your own orientation, and so I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit more about it, about your scholarly approach and critical frames in relation to the field of Black studies. As you said, gender studies, literary studies, cultural studies. Inform the writing that you do. And I'm interested sort of in hearing you talk about how your critical frames and your approach to writing and thinking, how it fits in the history of Black studies, how you see it as part of the tradition, but also what boundaries do you think it pushes, or what new horizons do you think it tries to open up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I started off, one thing to say is when I was in graduate school, and it was largely because my graduate school imploded at the time, my department did, that I ended up not becoming a 19th century Americanist. And so I started off as a 19th century Americanist, and that has nonetheless had this huge impact on my career, that my projects often start in the 19th century. Like, even like my thinking is like just always goes back to something in the 19th century. So with my first book, which is about sentimentality, which is something in literary studies that's usually talked about in relationship to 19th century literature and 18th century literature in the US and the UK. But I use it to talk about the 20th century and African American women producers and African American women as objects of sentimental discourse. My second book, which talks about comics and cartoon art, also starts in the 19th century when you started to see like editorial cartoons and representations of Black people in visual culture being mass produced. So there is this way that enslavement and, again, this sort of material history and how to think of Black oppression and to think about the relationship between the past and the present animates all of my work. So I'm understood as someone who works on contemporary culture. It's true. I work on the U.S. and contemporary culture, and I work on the popular. But more and more, I think it's almost impossible to do rigorous popular culture studies scholarship if you're not doing historical work. There's so many people doing hot takes in the world.
But I don't. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is only audio, and I'm so sad we didn't have the video when you just said hot takes. Your expression.
Well,
I'll remember it. That was a great expression. I know how you feel. Some
hot takes are very good, but I think that one of the things we can bring to some work as scholars is in discussing the popular is to think about long histories of things where people think that something just appeared today or 5 minutes ago. I mean, I have to, when I go back to teaching after my sabbatical, I'm going to have to stop with my heavy performance of, what do you mean that's old? I mean, my students, the longer you teach, and when you teach popular culture, like the things that people think are old, it just eventually just really brings you down. But because just things a few years ago are old now, so I can't presume that anyone knows anything about what was produced before. So like someone will talk about some new Black woman contemporary hip hop artist, which, I love that they bring those things to me, things that people I probably don't know or haven't heard of. And they'll say, this is the first person to really do sexuality in this way. And I'll say, oh, like Black women, I'll say, well, we could go back to Foxy Brown. Or we could go back to Bessie Smith. We could go back a little further. We can even maybe go back to the 19th century. So, I mean, I think that, having this historical orientation, particularly to African American history, really grounds a lot of what I do, as well as, what happened in the 19th century in how mass production began circulating ideas and discourse differently, right? What capitalism did to how people understood identity and how to think about that in relationship to race and gender. Like that just always animates my work. That's always there.
Yeah, I just have to say I teach in a class this semester where I have almost all first semester students. And I asked them at the beginning sort of, highlight of their summer sort of question. And they were listing off artists they went to see. And I was just like, I just felt like I'd been put in a crypt. I was just like, what are you talking? I can't tell if that's a name or a genre. Humbling. I have a 14-year-old, but he's recently stopped communicating his musical taste to me. And I'm like, we got to talk, son. Like, come on now. Well, let me sort of pick up on some of those things about your research and teaching as well. You mentioned graduate work, and your graduate work was in an English department, and so you had a disciplinary education, but your research and interests and teaching is so deeply embedded in Black studies and gender studies. And so I'm interested in hearing you talk a little bit about how that movement from disciplinary training to this other kind of, maybe another kind of discipline, or this multiple disciplinary approach to research and writing, how that movement has impacted how you conceive a research project, but also how you conceive a classroom.
Well, I had in graduate school, again, because my department imploded, I had half of my committee in my chair, Juanita Lubiano, was in literature, which was the department that you could be in literature and you might not read any literature at all, which wasn't Juanima's classroom, but it could be Jan Radway's classroom, who I also took class with and who was also on my committee. And I think with the two of them, but particularly I think with Radway's class, and her research really helped situate me as a cultural studies scholar that thinks about class conditions of production, and like the different aspects of cultural production, from readers to production to critics to theoretical frameworks. Like, what does it mean to put all of these things together in terms of interpreting how some cultural production works? So I like to think of my classroom as a place where we have an object. Let's start with an object. And then we say, how do we understand this? How do we historicize it? How does it circulate? How did it come to be? What kinds of questions do you ask about it if you don't know anything about it? And I think defamiliarizing the object, and sometimes these are objects they don't know at all, and I often give them things they don't know at all, but trying to defamiliarize actually the things they do know, which is what I do a lot of as well, I think does a lot of critical work in terms of helping people understand the world in which they maybe quickly interpret things, perhaps too quickly, and maybe slow down and try to imagine other ways of seeing. So I think that's so on one hand, being a literary studies scholar and being someone who was trained in close reading, right? Trained going to Duke at the time with, a certain kind of theoretical scaffolding in my approach. Obviously, that's always still there in everything I do, but this question that I have with my research that I also then try to bring to my classroom is like, there's something I look at and I say, I want to understand this, and what kinds of questions do I need to ask and get an answer to understand it? And that also leads to what kinds of disciplines do I need to engage with, or fields do I need to engage with to do that? So, with my first book, which the dissertation was a little more literary studies oriented, and the final book manuscript was less that, although there's still literature in it. Although it's weirdly like not categorized even at the Library of Congress as doing literary studies at all. I'm like, there's literature all through this book. I don't understand this. But, I ended up doing things like child abduction, which was still reading narrative, but then I started to think about media studies, and there's stuff about health discourse, and I had to look at some science literature about African Americans and pain, and, so what does the question lead me to? And the second book, comics and cartoon art, I didn't grow up reading comics and cartoons, but I, at least not, as a really thick or substantive fan. I read the funnies. I like Bloom County. There are things like that. But I started reading grad school. I went to my first job was at a place that had comics and cartoon scholars, and then also one of the biggest comics and cartoon archives in the world, the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum. And so I then had to learn this whole new field, right? Like, I was just like, okay, there's this field that's comic studies, and what is it? And I'm still bringing my consistent interest in the relationship between narrative and identity and politics to the project. But what is it about this object that makes me think about those questions. And then like the new book I'm working on, which is a fan studies book, I'm like trying to defamiliarize the question about why people understand the popular as having political value. And particularly why Black people understand the success of Black cultural productions and Black celebrities as having deep political import. And then so what is meaningful and important about that, but what are some possible costs? And so I'm actually looking at the idea of linked fate, which is a really well-known idea in African-American political science, but also just political science more broadly speaking, and just thinking about political theory in relationship to the popular. So that's always how I approach projects. It's this, what does the object require me to look into? And this is why I think it seems like every book takes me 10 years.
I love the defamiliarizing moments in classrooms. I mean, I also like it as a writer, right? Revisiting and revising. And it's very satisfying to do with students. I mean, I find them very excited, but it also mobilizes that sense of multiple resources. And, for me, I mean, I teach in, all my classes are in Black Studies. I'm part in the English department, but they just end up being Black Studies classes in the English department. But it's one of those moments where they're reminded of the real, power of Black Studies, right? Is the capacity to do anything in the most burdensome but also most liberated kind of way. And the way you describe that, how you approach research projects, I love that. It really resonated for me about, what's exciting about the field of Black Studies and also how bringing that to the classroom. I think it changes students. I was also thinking when I was asking the question, as a disciplinary training, knowing that you had done your PhD at Duke, generally, I think English departments are more and more difficult to even call disciplines. But, you were at Duke at that time when it was really the template for how precarious this idea of English as a discipline rather than English as this expansive experimental project could be. So,
well, the fight over it, yes, which is why the department exploded when I was there.
Well, I mean, there's that too. Yeah, so the big picture, right? Retrospect, very interesting. Having been there, I imagine it was a little stressful.
Yeah, it was. Most of my cohort left, and about 7 faculty in a year and a half. So it was a lot.
That's wild. It's also wild that there were enough jobs for people to leave, but let's just put that aside.
Yes, that was a very different moment. Yes, that people could just move. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you as one of the last two questions for you. This question, thinking about the field of Black Studies and its now 50-something year history, what do you think that the field has done well? But what do you think the field has also not done particularly well?
Interestingly enough, I think that it's probably the same thing. I think that the thing that the field does well is really grounding Black studies in and privileging the voices of everyday people. And I think that is something that the field does very well. At the same time, I think what the field cannot do well is then be resistant to or have encouraged readings of the field, I should say, if that's not what the work is doing, or if you're uncomfortable with certain kinds of theoretical frameworks or projects that seem not what Black studies should be, then I think you still all too often run into people who will have issues with it. Like, I think that too often there's still real questions about how do you deal with African-American artists who primarily work in abstraction. You are encountering, I think I've talked to some of my colleagues about this, and I've experienced this too, this resistance to theory or just even the academic study of Black studies at all, or for people who aren't Black sometimes studying Black studies, because there is this belief that it's okay to say it is me search, and that, primarily what you're doing is, um, providing a space, like the worst version that people will say that Black studies and feminist studies is, it's just providing a space for people to talk about their feelings. And I will say, like, that's really insulting to the field. Like, people spend a lot of time trying to learn a lot of things about the field. I didn't just wake up like this. I didn't just wake up knowing things about Blackness. Like, you have to do work. And I think that there's this weird discursive formation that can result in, again, disciplining people who are seen as doing some things outside of what Black studies should do. And a lot of times this comes up in relationship to theory. I used to say, when I was teaching theorizing race and ethnicity at Ohio State, to some grad students who were resistant to the sort of required theory class, some of them would be, and I'd say, I think if Hegel was good enough for Du Bois, and Marx and Marcuse are good enough for Angela Davis, and psychoanalysis and existentialism is good enough for Fanon, I don't know who I am to say that Black people don't do theory. And
I might borrow that, and I will cite you in my classrooms. But I really love that. That's amazing.
And that they'd be like, Professor Wanzo. But that sort of like ended it then. I don't think that works so well now. They'd just be like, oh, but that was then. And now, if you don't write or talk in the way that everyday people, write or talk, then you're, and I see this from a lot of scholars. And as someone who very intentionally writes for varied audiences, like sometimes I'll write something for the public sphere that then becomes an academic article, and an academic article can sometimes become something for the public sphere. I even more intentionally write some things, a lot of short pieces that are designed for the classroom anymore. It's a priority for me in my writing practice. I'm very irritated by the idea that there can't be a diversity of representation of what Black people do. And to me, it's just another way of limiting our humanity and possibility. So it's a weird split. It's the grounding it in the everyday and the idea of the forgotten Black folks and people who, may not have access to education, but still can theorize their own lives in ways that are really rich and important. But then also being the other side of that can be this weird articulation, I think, of what limit should be put on what Black studies properly should be.
Very nicely put. Thank you for that. I think that's, if nothing else, that's something for people to talk about. Listening to this episode, I you elevated the stakes in ways that I think you have to there at the end about the limiting of humanity. So I appreciate that a lot. Let me ask you the last question. Maybe this is, you've already started to answer it. In a Black studies context, what is the question you would want us to all be asking, or what's the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
Well, I don't even know if it's just me. I mean, at this particular moment, I think the future of Black studies, given the broader political climate, is a deep one. There are limitations. There's this work to limit admission of Black students to schools. There is a constant onslaught of attacks on the capabilities of Black people, the idea that we just walk in a room and it's the sign of our incompetence, our mere presence. And that's, Black people broadly speaking, and there's certainly a very explicit element of misogynoir around this. Like, there are all these attacks on Black women specifically as well. I think showing why having Black history and knowing things, just knowing things, knowing about Black suffering, knowing about enslavement, matter, and that there's this idea that if you focus on suffering, and it's not just coming from the current president, that that if you talk about suffering or there's any emphasis on, or you talk about slavery or Jim Crow or contemporary discrimination and racism, or call out racist jokes, that you are being overly serious or bringing people down or not focusing on what's good. Like, there's a real ideological war here of erasure that's understood as an aspect of patriotism. And so the whole discipline is going to have to figure out how to respond to this attack on the idea that our very existence is a rejection of what it means to be in the U.S., when I think that one of the things Black Studies has done is say that we are central to understanding the U.S. and also understanding the work of imperialism, and what Black possibility is, despite anti-Blackness around the world. So, I mean, that is what we've got to work on. I mean, I think it's suddenly become the central organizing question of our very existence.
And that is an amazing imperative moment, or articulation of an imperative as a moment to wrap up our conversation. I really appreciate it, and it brings it so much back to the very beginning of your conversation about your own education, the sense of, like, you can't tell this history of the United States without Black Ohio, right? And re-arriving at that moment of that same imperative and needing to rebuild those same kinds of things might be exasperating, might be exhausting, might be enraging, but it's work that has to be done. I'm really happy that you put it out there so clearly. So thank you for that. And thank you for this whole conversation. This has been absolutely fantastic. I'm so happy we made the time. I appreciate your thoughtfulness and insight. And I think the really hard, but also really amazing questions that you've put to anybody listening to this who cares about Black studies, about what we're doing today and what we're doing the next 10, 20 years. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Rebecca.
Well, thanks for having me. It was fun.
All right. Well, you have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.